In this video, I'm going to show you some simple painting techniques using washes and dry brushing. We'll do a lot of experimenting here with different colors and layering using this cobblestone street that we sculpted, molded, and cast in resin in the previous parts of this series. We'll start with the washes to get our dark base colors in the recessed areas, and then dry brush on some lighter colors to pick up the texture and highlights. So here are all the materials I need to start the washes. I'm using the original cobblestone road that I made in part 1. I gave this one a good spray with the Krylon white primer. We have our bucket of water here and some rags next to it. These are just pieces of t-shirts. This little terry cloth rag, this is cool because it will give you a bit of texture when you blot the wash. We have our palette paper and an assortment of brushes. I kind of picked out all my junky big brushes. I have a selection of really nice wash brushes, but I don't want to use them because this is just going to be rough and sloppy. In fact, these little chip brushes work great for washes, and you can get them for about 50 cents each on Amazon. I link them below. Now the paint. First we have a Payne's gray. This is always my default for the first base layer. This is really going to emphasize the dark shadows in between all the little cobblestones. But I'm going to add some other colors in too. A bit of red oxide here. Then I'm adding this blue that's all over my hand because I just opened a new bottle. It's got a tint of green and it's very saturated. Then I'm going to add a couple different yellows. This Turner yellow and then this brighter cadmium yellow that will just pop a little bit more. But back to the Payne's gray. I like to use this instead of a pure black because in the natural world, pure black doesn't really exist. Payne's gray has a hint of blue, which I think makes everything look a little bit more realistic. Next, put a little bit of each color on the paint palette. I highly recommend paint palettes. It keeps the paint from drying out with its smooth, slick surface. And I put an extra big blob of the Payne's gray, as that will get used the most. I really let the water soak into my brush, because one objective of a wash is to make it very watery so it flows into all the little nooks and crannies. All the recessed spots are where all the shadows are hiding, so really stab the brush into every little crevice. And I'll keep loading the brush back up with water to make sure it's really wet. And you can see I'm also adding random blotches of color. You might be saying that doesn't look like a cobblestone road with all that color, but most of that color will disappear when we dry brush on top. It really becomes subtle accents of color that pop out a bit from underneath the dry brushing. For me, all these accents of color are what really gives the piece a history and a story. Like maybe 100 lifetimes ago, this was a mountain giant's favorite stepping stone, and unfortunately some children were playing marbles on it. And all the little marbles got ground up into the cobblestone in the reddish pool here of children's blood. Next I take my rags and blot the top lightly. This just pulls the color off the raised areas and highlights the tops of the stone and the stone texture. Blotting with the terry cloth doesn't really do a whole lot here because there's already so much texture going on, but if you're doing this on a smooth surface, you can imprint the texture of the cloth or rag onto the piece. So like a burlap or a waffle knit can really give it a cool effect. Here I'm going back in with a small brush and hunting down those little white spots that I missed. Make sure to get all of these. Having little white dots where your blackest shadows should be can ruin the look. I really like the saturated blue, especially where it mixes with the yellow and creates a bit of green, like maybe there's some moss or algae growing there. The blue probably is the least realistic color, but I'm always going for a bit of a fantasy landscape. If you want hyper-realistic, stick with earthier tones. Finally, I hit the sides with the darker Payne's gray, but then blot the top edge of the cobblestone to help create a highlight around the entire piece. The last thing I'll do here is hold the piece vertically to let the watery stuff run down in between the rocks. This kind of mimics how water might run down a slanted street and adds some really interesting texture. I like how the colors mix and pool up around the sides of the taller rocks. So make sure when you're cutting your rocks, you vary the rock thickness. You can check out part 1 of this series if you want to see how I sculpted the road. I really like this murky green stuff here. And not to belabor the squished children anymore, but these oozing pools of red definitely add some mystery. And I love how the paint sometimes just cuts diagonally across a square. You can always go back and blot some more if something doesn't seem quite right. So here's what it looks like completely dry. At this point you can continue to add more washes or go straight to dry brushing. For the sake of experimentation, I'm going to do a wash over this quarter with a golden fluid acrylic transparent red iron oxide. Then I'm going to do a wash over this quarter with a regular acrylic red oxide, just to compare the difference between the fluid acrylic and the regular acrylic. And I'll keep the other half as is so we can use that as a base level when we dry brush. I love the golden fluid series. The paint is just a little bit thinner, so it's almost like a built-in wash. They have a transparent series. They can be very saturated in color and sometimes glossy. They're just a lot of fun to play with, especially when using washes and dry brushing. Layering them with regular acrylics can add a whole nother dimension to your painting. I'm not even really using this as a wash here because it's already so thin. I'm just adding a tiny bit of water and just painting a layer on top. This is a great direction to go if you want your road to look realistic. I'm really making sure to brush it into all the surface texture because I want a solid, even color. And I'm not even going to blot this with a cloth because I really want to push this square into the red zone. But I am going to do a more controlled type of blotting here by wiping and drying my brush off and then stabbing it into the areas where it's a bit heavy, especially into the deep crevices. The dry brush will soak up the little watery deposits of paint. This is not the big dry brushing technique, by the way. That is the next step. And here's the regular acrylic oxide. I'm adding a lot more water here and just letting the wash run down over the piece. And then I'm going to do a pretty aggressive blotting with the rags. Red oxide is one of my favorite colors because you can find it all over the natural world. It's in mud and dirt and mineral formations, and it's got a serious history in different art processes. Ceramics, metalsmithing, and pigments for paints. And fun fact, rust is a mixture of iron oxides on the surface of iron. So here it is after it's completely dry. And I think we have enough cool stuff going on with the washes where we can now move on to the dry brushing. This fluid acrylic leaves a bit of a glossy finish, which I think is great for creating a dark and spooky mood, like maybe some drippy catacombs or that maze labyrinth that the Minotaur lives in. And then this side over here, it's definitely more of a fantasy look with the red and the blue, and not normally a color combination I would choose for this, but it's kind of cool looking, and I think we can have some fun dry brushing some colors into it. I'm going to start with the 2 iron oxide squares first. And since we have a little red and blue right here, I think it would be fun to start dry brushing with some yellow. This is a yellow oxide, sometimes called yellow ochre. So we'll be creating a primary color scheme of red, yellow, and blue. I'm just going to dust a layer of the yellow on top here. And then I'm going to come in here and just run some yellow strands of it around here because I really like how the red oxide mixes with the yellow and creates this blood orange. Personally, I think orange is one of the most underrated colors. And then after all of that, we'll hit the whole thing with a white. So the yellow will just be a subtle underlayer. For dry brushing, I prefer the round-headed filbert brushes as opposed to the flatheads, because when you're dusting the brush over the surface, you get a more uniform blending. Sometimes with the flatheads, you can get these sharp lines of paint from the corners. The whole idea of dry brushing is that you're not using any water at all. I'm putting very little paint on my brush and then even wiping some off on the scrap paper and just lightly dusting the surface. Big sweeping movements that are highlighting the raised areas of the cobblestone. And make sure to go in all directions. Sometimes I'll wipe my brush off on my glove to remove paint or just to get an idea of how heavy the paint is. This is the first dry brush layer. I'll be doing a white over the top, so don't be afraid to go heavy here if you're doing multiple layers, because the underlayers will most likely get covered up by the top layers. I recommend lots of light layers that you methodically build up until you get the intensity you want. Some spots I'll go in and hit with more paint just to add some variety. To finish off this layer, I'm going to bleed it into the other square a bit just to blend them together and see if we can't make it one uniform piece. And then I go a little bit heavier with the yellow here and brush in those veiny patterns for some variety. And then I'll do another little accent spot right here, like maybe this is picking up some light from a flickering torch or some Lumos wand spell. So this whole section has just a little bit of a yellow highlight. And then here we kind of zigzag here and then cut across here. I really like the variation going on here, so now we're ready for the top layer. For the final layer, I'm going to be using a white. And there are all sorts of whites out there. Here's a titanium white, which is your bright white. This is an off-white called unbleached white, and this is called parchment, which is a white with a tiny hint of green. This bright white will give you the most contrast, but sometimes it's a little too bright. The unbleached white here is a little bit too brown for me, and the light color tints from this parchment can add some really nice effects, but it's also really easy to add a touch of whatever color you want to make your own white. But I'm going to start off with a really soft dusting of the bright white so you can see what that high contrast looks like. I'm using a filbert again, loading up just a little bit of paint, wiping most of it off on the paper, and then just lightly dusting it on top. The bright white might look a little unnatural, but concerning contrast, this is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. I know a guy who worked on the sets for Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, and he said they used a ton of bright white on those sets because they wanted a crazy amount of contrast. If you Google the sets, you can see how white some of them are. Let's try a little bit of the unbleached titanium in the middle section here. The unbleached looks a little more natural. It blends in with the colors some, cuts the contrast a bit, kind of looks like there's a little bit of dirt and mud on the rocks. When you're layering, try and always go lighter in value, so you're progressively building lighter layers on top of lighter layers. So it makes sense here that I'm doing a yellow then a white. Let's also try the parchment. Most of the time I'll add some tint of color to my white, like a complementary color if I really want it to pop, or some analogous color if I want everything to blend in. I also think it's good to have some dominant color scheme, otherwise you risk it becoming just too distracting with too many colors. But on the flip side, this thing has almost every color in the rainbow, and I'm kind of totally into it. But you should also be concerned about it being too distracting from whatever you're displaying on top of it. That's going to be your focal point, I'm assuming, so the base should be secondary. Unless it's for some type of diorama where the environment is just as important. They all kind of look cool, and they all blend in together. I think the most noticeable difference is created by the two iron oxide washes. I prefer the fluid personally, but the other one works for me as well. When I first applied it, you might have thought, whoa, that's a lot of red. But the end result is just some small reddish pools around the stones, so I'd say don't be afraid to really lay down the color. It will usually disappear with the blotting and dry brushing. For this other half, I'm just going to do one layer of the bright white using these chip brushes. These brushes are great for washes and dry brushing on larger pieces. So same as before, just a little bit of paint, wipe it off a bit, and a light dusting of the color. Just for fun, let's divide this into thirds and spray a matte, a satin, and a gloss on top. I link the Krylon series of sprays below because they're my favorite whenever I'm using acrylics. But first, let's critique our final masterpiece. Overall, I kind of like all the different sections, but I will say my favorites are still the iron oxide washes. Even the really bright white on top, this just looks old and worn, and I really like the contrast, and how the fluid wash here creates all these unholy darks. But I think even the blues with these bright yellows and greens can also be applicable to certain situations. I mean, if you think of big picture stuff, we do have the Song of Fire over here, and then the Song of Ice over here. So first the gloss, then the satin, and finally the matte. Upon final inspection, we have this: gloss, satin, and matte. For me, gloss always has a plasticky feel, so I'm not a huge fan of it. And the satin should be just a matted version of the gloss, which is kind of nice. And then the matte you can't really see at all, and it actually removes any of the gloss that the paint's created. But the matte is something I use on almost all of my acrylic painted figures just to seal it and give it a little protection. So it's definitely worth mentioning. If you'd like to see a comparison between 5 different Payne's grays or see some dry brushing techniques with Liquitex iridescent and interference colors, you can click on these 2 videos here. Thanks for watching.